do you think the market can bear? What do you think that the Democrats can build consensus on with narrow majorities in both chambers? What do you expect to see, or do you have a strong feeling about where this is going?
Well, I'd actually like to ask you about this too. I'm not ready to give up on the idea of a compromise with some Republicans on infrastructure. And by the way, I don't think Democrats are either. Right? I think when I believe Klain has been quoted here and there, or it was someone in the White House was quoted essentially saying, we actually think that the conversations are constructive. And of course, the offer that Republicans put out is a tiny fraction. It's not that really a good faith offer, but it seems to me that there's still an opening to maybe get to like 800 billion or something like that on that first chunk, right? I would think that a bunch of these Republican moderates want that. And actually, I'd love to, and they can do the second big chunk through reconciliation. And I think that works for everybody, right? Doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think to me, it reminds me, it's kind of akin to the immediate conversation we were having over the American Rescue Plan, where, to your point, it was a much smaller Republican offer. There was a massive chasm in the middle. It didn't make sense for Biden. They could get what they wanted on the big side, so they just went with that. And I think it's kind of similar in the sense that if you can assure yourself lockstep among Republicans, among Democrats, then you do what you can. If you're not sure about that, you're not sure what the market can bear, then it absolutely makes sense, to your point, to get what you can and go back for more. I think the tricky part is, if you're Republicans, if you're Shelley Moore Capito, or if you're Mitch McConnell, I think there's a wariness there to, sure, there's some credit to be gained from indulging a bipartisan process, but if you're just going to get rolled on the back end, I think there's some wariness, where I think there's absolutely not only a path, but a necessity to work together is on the highway bill, on the surface transportation side, which of course is the ticking clock here. The only legislative forcing mechanism is the fact that the FAST Act authorization runs out at the end of September. That's conspicuously left out of the American Jobs Plan. And Secretary Buttigieg has repeatedly delineated that in the hearing. So I think they don't really have a choice when it comes to shoring up the highway trust fund and that sort of thing. That can't really be done under the parameters they put it on themselves for reconciliation. So I do absolutely think they have to, even if they kick the can, it has to be done through regular order. So that would satisfy everybody, and I think give everybody a sort of face-saving win. So it's just a question of how big that is. And to your point, I think that's a sweet spot. And if Democrats see the value in that, then it can happen. But I do think it's the 1-2 punch of how much are we willing to stretch to do bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship if we know that there's going to be $1 trillion more, or $2 trillion, whatever, more coming right after that. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's definitely, I can see it from the Republican perspective. Here's what I think probably the Democratic perspective. Maybe the way to look at it is that for a lot of these Democratic moderates who are facing re-election, right, in the House, and for some of these senators, right, you would think, and for Biden, right, they really would like to have a deal with Republicans. Imagine if you're a vulnerable House member, right, in a very tough district, a vulnerable Democrat in a very tough district. You'd love to be able to say, we made Washington work. You see that infrastructure project? That's bipartisan, and Biden did that. Right. And maybe for that reason, it becomes hard for Republicans to support something like along those lines, in addition to the fact that more spending is coming down the pipe. Of course, and here's a question for you. Couldn't you get, could you get 10 Republican senators to support something that you could do with 60 in the Senate? What pay for might work for 10 Republicans, right? And why couldn't Republicans essentially tell themselves, okay, well, I can deliver this chunk of good infrastructure and then beat the crap out of the Democrats when they do this huge spending thing on all this bad infrastructure later, right?
I think the tricky part is, number one, I think the rescue plan exercise laid this bare. If you count to 10, it's easy to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When you count to 10 and realize who that 10th person is, it's pretty striking to realize, how where the center of gravity is within the conference. So that
Yeah.
presents its own challenges. But I don't think things don't happen on a 60 vote basis in this environment with these rules. I think it either fails or it gets 80 votes. And honestly, the last couple of weeks have been a testament to that. Both the hate crimes legislation, 94-2 or whatever, the water infrastructure legislation that just passed, 89-2 or something. If it's going to happen, there's a cascade effect. But the trick is, to your point, getting over that hump. And I don't see 10 Republicans. Look, I think the gang of 20 that seems to have emerged are really critical in that regard. And as we saw at the end of last year in the COVID context, it was really important for that group to go out and demonstrate what there was a market for, and then leadership kind of comes around to that. So if they can come up with something like that, I think there's something there. The Problem Solvers Caucus just came out with their sort of framework of proposals, but it's just, I think you can rationally get yourself there, but I think the realities of the incentives and just how damn close everybody feels they are to getting back the majority, if only they can hold down the fort for however long. Redistricting, the reapportionment news that we just got probably only makes that feel closer. And so I think it's a tricky proposition, particularly as people are limbering up for an anticipated primary and trying to make sure they're not getting outflanked.
Can I just ask you about this? You know how these Republicans are viewing this stuff. Like, to me, it's just so baffling that infrastructure would be something that's hard for Republicans at a time when there's this chatter out there about them becoming the real working class party. I mean, think back to Steve Bannon. He gave a really now obviously important interview right after Trump won, in which he said something like, we're going to throw $2 to $3 trillion in infrastructure. We're going to build this. We're going to build that. We're going to entirely realign the country, right? We're going to realign the multiracial working class behind Trumpism and economic nationalism. And infrastructure was a huge part of that, right? And then, of course, the first thing Bannon does is work with Stephen Miller on the Muslim ban, right? And so, and they never ended up doing the infrastructure. And I think there was some reporting where Bannon made kind of a half-hearted push internally, but extremely half-hearted to try and get the tax, try and raise taxes on investment income and so forth and so on. I forget exactly what he pushed for, but there was sort of a general sense that he did kind of represent some type of populism that Trump did run on, right? And it just
to your point, I think he immediately kind of soiled whatever opportunity there was there, but
yeah.
At a basic level, Trump agreed with that, but he never had. I mean, as we know, he never had the attention span or the discipline to think about these things deeply enough to put something forward and actually fight for it. So it went to other people in his administration, if you remember, and they came out with principles for an infrastructure plan. And it was
right.
basically all, financed public-private partnerships, private activity bonds, important things that would be part of any bipartisan plan that Republicans were getting on board with, but not a non-starter for Democrats, which goes back to the problem where infrastructure is a word that everybody can agree on, but you can't figure out what it means because it means it's an elastic definition. And B, you certainly can't agree how to pay for it. And to the extent that there's a policy, good there, I don't think anybody can acknowledge. Nobody wants to own user fees. Nobody wants to own a right. VMT. And so, I mean, you saw it where Republicans in their framework tried to. I mean, Biden and Buttigieg they've already washed their hands of it. They know they don't want to touch the politics of a gas tax hike or a VMT. Republicans are sort of making noises about how it should be a user fee and not, a business tax financed, but they can't say the words. And it goes back to the good faith issue. I mean, there has to be some level of handholding and real or trust that you're not just going to get beaten to death with each other by proposing the thing that's probably the right thing to do in terms of a sustainable financing mechanism. So I think that's part of the trouble. But but yeah, Trump and his people never agreed on what infrastructure should look like, and it just never went anywhere. And that's how we ended up with infrastructure as a punchline, infrastructure week as a punchline.
Well, I'll tell you,
Um,
that's why, I mean, that's what was so kind of arresting about Bannon's comment, right? At least he didn't, maybe he didn't know what he was saying, but the implication that many people on my side took from what he said was that he was talking about a major public expenditure. And from the point of view of Democrats who had just lost in 2016, right, to this economic nationalist message, right, that was a kind of terrifying prospect that he actually would do this, right? And so now we're at a point where, like, we're saying that the Republican base wouldn't be able to handle infrastructure repair. I'm just, you know, I don't.
I think so much of it is just muscle memory, and I mean, going back to learned lessons on both sides. I mean, I think both sides are acting in to a large degree based on lessons that were learned this time, 11, 12 years ago, where just saying no works, keeping your fingerprints off things works, running out the clock works. Conversely, I think Democrats and Biden had a front row seat to this, but learned that waiting around to engage and ultimately getting something smaller than what you could have gotten on your own, probably not the greatest idea. There's a sense of urgency because the window is narrow and you better act now because you might not have the votes, not even the next election, but like you have a chamber full of septuagenarians. Like what happens if somebody gets a cold, let alone in the middle of a pandemic? So I think all these things inform what's going on right now. And it puts you in this position where these are things that notionally everybody agrees on and should be able to get it done. And yet the reality of the immediate incentives before them make it so it's tough.